Okay, everybody, we are converting between fractions, decimals, and percentages this week. So the first thing we're going to look at is getting from a percentage to a decimal. And all we need to do for that is to divide the number by 100. So if I have 67%, I just divide 67 by 100, that gives me 0.67. And then if I want to go the other way, so I start with a decimal and I want to get that to a percentage, I just times by 100. So if I had 0.7, that will become 70%. Be careful with ones like that. Sometimes people put that as 7%, but that would have only been times by 10. So make sure you are timesing by 100. If I want to get from a percentage to a fraction, I just put the number out of 100. So if I have 20%, I'm just putting this out of 100. So that becomes 20 out of 100. And then remember to simplify if you can. So 20 out of 100, well, I can divide both of these numbers by 10. So that would give me 2 over 10. And I can simplify this down again. I can half them both. I can divide them by 2, and that gives me 1/5. So 20% would be the same as 1/5. And then if I want to go the other way, so I start with a fraction, I'm just reversing. So I could start with 3/10. I need to get this back to out of 100, okay? We always need to have it out of 100. So I need to think about what I can do to 10 to get me back to 100. I can times it by 10. 10 times 10 gives me 100. And remember, whatever you do to one of the numbers, you do to the other. So 3 times 10 will give me 30. So I now have 30 out of 100. And then once I'm back to this out of 100, that just gives me the percentage. That would be 30%. And the final ones are decimals and fractions. So if we start with a decimal and we want to get to a fraction, again, we just put this out of 100. So if the decimal is 0.89, that's just going out of 100. So 89 out of 100. And then the other way, fraction to a decimal, we use the top number. So if the fraction is 47 out of 100, we use this top number, and that just becomes our decimal, so 0.47. However, it might not always be that easy with those ones. You might get a fraction like this, which is 8 out of 10, and then you go back to these steps that we followed over here. We have to get it back to 100. So again, I'm going to times this by 10, because that will get me to 100 on the bottom. So then 8 times 10 gives me 80, and now I know that will be 0.8 or 0.80. So something that comes up quite a lot as an exam question is trying to order these things. So you could get a mixture of all three. So we've got some percentages, some decimals, and some fractions here, and we need to be able to put these things in order. So what you need to do is you need to make them all the same. And the easiest thing to do is normally to put them as a percentage or a decimal. I'm going to choose percentages just because I prefer them. So that means that 60% is going to stay the same. I don't need to do anything to that. I need to change this half. Well, hopefully you've all remembered that a half is the same as 50%. Now I need to change this decimal. So we just use our steps over here. I've got a decimal. I need to times it by 100 to get me to the percentage. So 0.3 times by 100 will give me 30%. I've then got 3/4. So again, we just follow these steps we had up here. We need to get this back out of 100. So I know that 4 times 25 gives me 100. So I'm going to do 3 25s. That gives me 75%. Hopefully some of you will have also remembered that 3/4 is 75%. And then the final one, 0.4, we're doing the same as we did to 0.3. We just need to times it by 100. And that will give me 40%. So I can now really clearly see which of these percentages is the biggest and which is the smallest. So the last thing we need to do is to just put them into order. Now, when we put them into order, we have to use these numbers that we started with at the top. So the smallest one we know is 30%, but we're going to write that as 0.3. And then the next smallest one would be the 40%, but again, we write it as it originally was, as 0.4. Then it's going to be the 50%, which is a half, then the 60%, and then the 3/4. So we've now managed to order them. So your tasks. Make sure you check, as always, if you're Key Stage 3 or Key Stage 4. Unfortunately, Key Stage 3, there are no questions on this in your CGP books. So you're going to have a look at these links that I've put here below. And as always, the questions are really repetitive. So just do what you can on question 1. Once you know what you're doing, move on to question 2 and so on. And of course, try and work up to getting down to these exam style questions at the bottom.